The morning of July 7th, 1944, dawned grey and wet over Saipan's northern coast. Private First Class Harold Meyer crouched in a foxhole along the Tanapag Plain, watching the jungle 200 yards to his front. Rain had fallen through the night, turning the coral dust and volcanic ash into slick mud that clung to everything. His rifle felt heavy in his hands. His uniform was soaked through. He had not slept. Meyer was 19 years old, from Schenectady, New York. He had joined the 105th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Infantry Division 18 months earlier, trained at Fort McClellan in Alabama, shipped to Hawaii, then deployed to the Central Pacific. 3 weeks ago, he had landed on Saipan's southwestern beaches under withering machine gun fire. Since then, he had fought his way north across 12 miles of the most brutal terrain in the Pacific War. Now he was here, along this coastal plain, with orders to hold a defensive line that stretched nearly 3,000 yards with fewer than 600 men. Behind him, less than 1,000 yards away, lay the bodies of nearly 25,000 Japanese and American soldiers who had died fighting for this island. Ahead of him, somewhere in that jungle, were the last 4,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan. Meyer knew they were coming. Everyone knew. The Japanese had nowhere left to retreat. They were trapped against the northern cliffs with the ocean at their backs. They had lost. The island was lost. The battle was over. Except it was not over. Not for the Japanese. Because something fundamental had shifted in how they fought. For 3 years, since Pearl Harbor, American forces had encountered Japanese troops who defended positions with fanatic determination. But what was about to happen on this rain-soaked plain was different. This was not defense. This was not tactical withdrawal. This was something American military doctrine had no name for. The Japanese called it gyokusai, shattering the jewel, mass suicide attack. Not the spontaneous Banzai charges Americans had seen at Tarawa or the Marshall Islands. Those were tactical assaults, violent but purposeful. Gyokusai was different. It was annihilation as strategy, death as duty. An entire military force, ordered by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, to destroy itself while killing as many of the enemy as possible. Meyer did not know the Japanese word. He did not understand the cultural weight behind it. But in a few hours, he would experience its reality. And what happened on this coastal plain would become the largest suicide attack in the history of modern warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem for the Americans was strategic. Saipan sat 1,500 miles south of Tokyo in the Mariana Islands chain. It was Japanese territory, mandated to Japan by the League of Nations after World War I. By 1944, more than 25,000 Japanese civilians lived on the island alongside the military garrison. The island was not just another Pacific outpost. It was considered part of Japan itself. For the United States, Saipan represented something more valuable than gold. It was an airbase. Once captured and secured, American engineers could build runways long enough for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to reach the Japanese home islands. From Saipan, the United States could bomb Tokyo directly. That capability would change the entire strategic calculus of the war. The decision to invade Saipan was made in March 1944 by Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The operation was codenamed Forager. It would involve more than 535 ships and 127,000 troops. The Northern Attack Force, Task Force 52, consisted of 2 Marine divisions, the 2nd and the 4th, commanded by Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith. They called him Howlin' Mad Smith. He had earned the nickname. The plan was straightforward. The Marines would land on the southwestern beaches on June 15th. They would secure the beachhead, push inland, capture the airfield at Aslito, then drive north to clear the island. The Army's 27th Infantry Division would follow 2 days later as reinforcements. Total Japanese strength on Saipan was estimated at 25,000 to 30,000 troops. Intelligence suggested the defenders were well entrenched, but could be overwhelmed through superior firepower and coordinated assault. The estimate was accurate. The assessment that Japanese forces could be overwhelmed proved incomplete, because American planners did not fully understand what they were facing. They understood Japanese tactics. They understood defensive positions, night attacks, infiltration. Understand was what happened when Japanese forces had no hope of victory and no possibility of reinforcement. What they did not understand was gyokusai. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. Naval bombardment started 3 days earlier. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of shells into suspected Japanese positions. The bombardment looked devastating. It sounded overwhelming, but most Japanese defenses were positioned on reverse slopes, hidden in caves, protected by the island's volcanic terrain. The shells exploded on empty hillsides, while defenders waited underground. At 0830 hours on June 15th, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. 8,000 Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions landed in amphibious tractors. They were met immediately with machine gun fire, mortar fire, artillery fire. The beaches were killing zones. Japanese defenders had pre-positioned artillery on the central highlands with direct observation of the landing areas. They waited until the Marines were exposed on the beaches, then opened fire. Marine casualties on the first day exceeded 3,500 men. Some units lost 60% of their strength before reaching the tree line, but the Marines kept coming. By nightfall, they had established a beachhead 6 miles wide and half a mile deep. It was not enough. It was barely a foothold, but it was enough to bring in reinforcements. The 27th Infantry Division landed on June 17th. The 105th Regiment, Harold Meyer's unit, came ashore in the second wave. They pushed inland toward Aslito Airfield through swamps, cane fields, and Japanese defensive positions that had to be cleared one by one. The fighting was close, brutal, exhausting. Every cave was a potential ambush. Every hill concealed machine gun nests. By June 23rd, American forces controlled the southern third of Saipan. But the cost had been staggering. Marine and Army casualties exceeded 10,000 men. Japanese casualties were higher, perhaps 15,000 killed, but the defenders still held the northern two-thirds of the island, including the mountainous terrain around Mount Tapochau, the highest point on Saipan. The terrain was nightmare. Steep hills, sheer cliffs, dense jungle, caves everywhere. American soldiers gave the landmarks names that reflected their experience: Death Valley, Purple Heart Ridge, Hell's Pocket. These were not dramatic exaggerations. These were accurate descriptions of places where men died by the hundreds, trying to advance a few hundred yards. The 105th Infantry Regiment fought through this terrain for 2 weeks. They assaulted Japanese positions on hills where visibility was measured in feet. They cleared caves with grenades and flamethrowers. They carried wounded comrades down cliffs under fire. By early July, they had reached the northern coastal plain near Tanapag village. They were exhausted. Their ranks were depleted. They had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks. On July 4th, the regiment was ordered to advance north along the western coast toward the village of Makunsha. The mission was to drive the remaining Japanese forces into the northern corner of the island where they could be eliminated. The 205th Regiment formed the western flank of the American advance. On their right, the 4th Marine Division pushed north along the eastern coast. In the center, the 2nd Marine Division had been pulled into reserve. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien commanded the 1st Battalion of the 105th Regiment. O'Brien was 42 years old, from Troy, New York. He had joined the New York National Guard in 1917, served in France during World War I, returned to civilian life as a lawyer, then been called back to active duty in 1940. He was quiet, methodical, and completely devoted to his men. By July 6th, O'Brien's 1st Battalion was dug in along a railroad track that ran parallel to the coast near Tanapag Plain. The 2nd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Jensen, was positioned on the railroad's western side. Between the two battalions was a gap, not a large gap, maybe 300 yards, but in that gap was open ground, exposed approaches, insufficient fields of fire. O'Brien saw the weakness. He reported it to regiment. He requested reinforcements to plug the gap. He was told no reinforcements were available. The entire division was stretched thin. Every unit was under strength. He would have to hold with what he had. O'Brien had approximately 550 men in his battalion. Jensen had about the same. Together, the two battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment defended a front of nearly 3,000 yards with 1,100 soldiers. The Japanese were assembling less than 2 miles away. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu, Saito, commanded Japanese forces on Saipan. Saito was 53 years old, a career officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1911. He had served in China, commanded divisions, earned a reputation for aggressive tactics and personal courage. By July 6, 1944, he commanded a shattered force. The 43rd Infantry Division had landed on Saipan in February 1944 with 30,000 men. Now, after 3 weeks of fighting, fewer than 5,000 remained. They were starving, exhausted, low on ammunition. Many were wounded. Some could barely walk. The survivors were scattered across the northern jungle in small groups, cut off from communication, surviving on whatever food and water they could scavenge. Saito understood the situation clearly. There would be no reinforcements. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been devastated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th. 3 carriers lost, hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The fleet that was supposed to resupply and reinforce Saipan had been annihilated. There would be no relief. On July 4th, Saito received orders from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The orders were explicit. Hold Saipan at all costs. If holding was impossible, die honorably. Do not surrender. Do not be captured. Destroy as much of the enemy as possible, then commit gyokusai. Saito read the orders. He understood what they meant. He had perhaps 72 hours before American forces overran his position completely. He could die in a cave, hunted like an animal, or he could die leading one final attack. The choice was not difficult. On July 6th, Saito issued orders to his remaining commanders. All able-bodied troops were to assemble near Makunsha village. All walking wounded were to participate. Civilians who wished to join were welcome. They would attack at dawn on July 7th. The objective was the American line along Tanapag Plain. The goal was simple: kill 10 Americans each before dying. If every Japanese soldier and civilian killed 10 Americans, they would destroy the entire 27th Infantry Division. The orders went out through messengers. Radio communication had broken down. Runners moved through the jungle carrying handwritten instructions. Assemble at Makunsha. Bring all weapons. Bring all ammunition. If you have no rifle, bring a knife. If you have no knife, bring a sharpened stick. If you cannot walk, crawl. Every man fights. Everyone dies. By the evening of July 6th, approximately 4,000 Japanese troops had assembled. Some were infantry from the 43rd Division. Others were naval personnel from the 5th Special Base Force. Some were support troops, cooks, clerks, engineers. Perhaps 300 were civilians, men who had lived on Saipan before the war and now faced capture by the Americans. Many were armed only with bayonets tied to bamboo poles. Some had rocks. A few had swords. 3 tanks had survived the 3 weeks of fighting. They would lead the attack. The tanks had fuel for perhaps 2 hours of operation. Their crews knew they would not survive the assault. Behind the tanks would come the able-bodied infantry with rifles and machine guns. Behind them would come the walking wounded with whatever weapons they could carry. Behind them would come those who could barely stand, armed with grenades and knives. Saito met with his officers on the evening of July 6th. He shared sake, the last bottle available. He wrote final letters to his family. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, he committed seppuku, ritual suicide. His chief of staff, Colonel Takuji Suzuki, took command of the attack force. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Japanese Central Pacific Fleet, committed suicide at the same time. Nagumo had commanded the carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Now he was trapped on Saipan with no ships, no aircraft, no hope. He chose to die with his troops. The rain that had fallen through the afternoon continued into the evening. It was heavy, tropical rain that reduced visibility to a few yards. American soldiers along the defensive line could hear nothing over the sound of rain on leaves, rain on metal helmets, rain drumming on foxhole covers. They could see nothing beyond the immediate edges of their positions. At midnight, the rain stopped. The clouds parted. The moon came out, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. American troops along the Tanapag Plain looked north across open ground toward the jungle. They saw movement, shapes in the darkness. Hundreds of shapes. Private First Class Harold Meyer, in his foxhole along the railroad track, gripped his M1 rifle tighter. He had 8 rounds in the clip, 4 more clips in his ammunition pouches, 32 rounds total. He had 2 grenades. That was all. Supply lines had been disrupted. Ammunition was rationed. He would have to make every shot count. At 04:45 hours on July 7, 1944, the Japanese attacked. The assault began with a signal, 3 red flares launched from the Japanese assembly area, then silence. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the night exploded with noise, thousands of voices screaming, battle cries, war chants, the names of emperors and gods. The sound was inhuman, overwhelming, designed to paralyze defenders before the attack even reached their lines. 3 Japanese tanks appeared first, grinding out of the jungle onto the coastal plain. They fired their main guns at suspected American positions. The shells exploded among the foxholes. Then came the infantry, not in organized waves, not in tactical formations, just mass. Thousands of men charging straight ahead, screaming, firing rifles, throwing grenades. Some carried swords, some carried knives, some were unarmed, simply running toward the American lines as if speed and ferocity alone would overwhelm the defenders. The American troops opened fire. Machine guns hammered, rifles cracked in continuous rhythm. Mortar crews dropped shells into tubes as fast as they could reload. Artillery batteries behind the front lines fired into pre-plotted coordinates where forward observers had identified Japanese assembly areas. The noise was continuous, overwhelming. The muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like daylight, then faded, then flashed again. Tracers crisscrossed the open ground, red streaks that showed where machine gun fire was concentrated. The Japanese kept coming. The first wave hit the American forward positions within minutes. They overran foxholes through sheer mass. 3 Japanese soldiers would charge a position, American defenders would shoot 2, and the third would jump into the foxhole with bayonet or knife. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along the entire line. Some Japanese soldiers carried satchel charges, canvas bags filled with explosives. They would run toward American positions, throw the charges, then detonate themselves along with anyone nearby. Others simply threw themselves onto American machine gun positions, using their bodies to block the barrels long enough for comrades behind them to advance. Meyer fired his rifle until the clip ejected with that distinctive M1 ping. He reloaded, fired again. The Japanese were everywhere. They poured through the gap between the 1st and 2nd battalions. They flanked positions. They infiltrated through tall grass that concealed their movements. Within 15 minutes, the American front line had collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien was at his command post, 50 yards behind the front line, when the attack hit. He could see the situation deteriorating immediately. His forward companies were being overwhelmed. The Japanese breakthrough in the center threatened to split his battalion. If they reached his command post, they would cut off his entire force from any possibility of withdrawal or reinforcement. O'Brien grabbed his carbine. He ran forward into the fight. His executive officer tried to stop him. Battalion commanders do not lead counterattacks personally. O'Brien ignored him. He ran toward the breach, firing his carbine, shouting orders to whatever men he could find. Rally here, form a line, pour fire into that gap, do not let them through. Men who saw O'Brien running forward under fire found courage they did not know they had. If the old man would stand in that hell, so would they. Marines and soldiers formed small defensive perimeters. They fired into the masses of Japanese troops pouring through the breach. They threw grenades until their arms gave out. They fixed bayonets and fought hand to hand when Japanese soldiers closed with them. O'Brien was hit multiple times. Rifle rounds, grenade, shrapnel. He refused to fall back. He remained standing, firing, directing his men. When last seen alive, he was standing upright in the open, firing into Japanese forces that were enveloping his position. He was killed there, on the front line, with his men. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Benjamin Salomon was 500 yards behind the front line, running a battalion aid station in a tent near the regimental headquarters. Salomon was 29 years old, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had graduated from the University of Southern California Dental College in 1937. He was a dentist. He should not have been at an aid station. He should have been treating dental problems in the rear areas. But Salomon had volunteered to replace the 2nd Battalion's surgeon who had been wounded by mortar fire a week earlier. There was little dental work needed during active combat. Salomon wanted to be useful, so he had taken over the aid station, treating wounded soldiers as they were carried in from the front lines. By 0500 hours on July 7th, Salomon had 30 wounded men in his tent. Some had bullet wounds, others had lost limbs to artillery. Some were unconscious from blood loss. Corpsman On worked frantically, applying bandages, starting plasma transfusions, preparing men for evacuation to field hospitals further back. The noise from the front line was continuous. Everyone in the aid station could hear the machine gun fire, the explosions, the screaming. But they were focused on saving the wounded. They assumed the front line would hold. At approximately 05:15, 4 Japanese soldiers burst into the aid station tent. They had broken through the American lines and infiltrated 500 yards into the rear area. They were looking for targets. They found wounded Americans who could not defend themselves. One Japanese soldier bayoneted a wounded American on a cot. Salomon saw it happen. He grabbed a rifle from a nearby rack. He shot the soldier, killing him instantly. The other 3 Japanese soldiers turned toward Salomon. He worked the bolt on his rifle, chambered another round, shot a second soldier. The 3rd soldier rushed at him with a bayonet. Salomon parried the bayonet, then drove his own bayonet into the man's chest, killing him. The 4th soldier attacked with a knife. Salomon kicked the knife from his hand, shot him with his rifle, then turned to help a wounded American who had grabbed the knife and stabbed the soldier to ensure he was dead. The entire action took less than 30 seconds. Salomon looked around the aid station. Blood everywhere. Wounded men terrified. Corpsmen staring at him in shock. And more Japanese soldiers visible outside the tent, moving through the area, hunting for targets. Salomon made a decision. He ordered the corpsmen to evacuate the wounded immediately. Get them out. Carry them. Drag them. Get them to the regimental aid station. Move now. The corpsman hesitated. What about you? Salomon loaded his rifle. I will hold them off. Go. The corpsmen began evacuating the wounded. They carried men on stretchers. They dragged men who could not walk. They supported men who were barely conscious. Salomon moved to the tent entrance. He could see perhaps 50 Japanese soldiers moving through the area. He fired into them, dropped 2, worked the bolt, fired again. Outside the tent was a machine gun position. 4 Marines had been manning it. All 4 were now dead. The Browning M1919A 4 machine gun was still functional. Salomon ran to it. He checked the ammunition belt. Half full. Enough. He opened fire. The machine gun spat 600 rounds per minute. Salomon swept it across the approaching Japanese troops. Bodies fell. The Japanese took cover. Salomon kept firing. The barrel grew hot. He poured water from a canteen on it to cool it. He kept firing. Japanese soldiers began flanking his position. Salomon could see them moving through the grass on both sides. He repositioned the machine gun, dragging it a few feet to get a better angle. He fired into the flanking troops. More bodies fell. The machine gun jammed. Salomon cleared it, reloaded, fired again. For the next hour, Captain Benjamin Salomon fought alone. He fired the machine gun until Japanese dead piled so high in front of his position that he could no longer see over them to aim. He dragged the machine gun to a new position. He fired until that position was also blocked by bodies. He moved again. He fired again. He was hit multiple times. Rifle rounds, bayonet thrusts, grenade shrapnel. He kept firing. At 0630 hours, American reinforcements arrived. Marines from the 2nd Division, rushing forward to plug the breach in the line. They found Salomon's aid station. They found the evacuated wounded at the regimental headquarters. They found Captain Salomon's body slumped over the machine gun. In front of his position were 98 dead Japanese soldiers. Salomon had been shot 76 times. He had 24 bayonet wounds. Medical examiners later determined that at least 24 of those wounds had been inflicted while he was still alive, still fighting. He had moved the machine gun 4 separate times, each move required because enemy corpses had blocked his field of fire. Salomon had given the wounded men in his aid station enough time to reach safety. Every one of them survived. Salomon died there, alone. Holding a defensive position he knew he could not possibly survive, because it was the only way to save his patients. The Japanese breakthrough along the coastal plain spread like a flood. By 0600 hours, they had advanced more than 1,000 yards through the American lines. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment were shattered. Companies that had started the night with 100 men were down to 30 or 40 effectives. Some units were completely overrun, soldiers killed in their foxholes or forced to withdraw under overwhelming pressure. The Japanese surge reached the artillery positions. Battery D of the 10th Marine Regiment was positioned about 400 yards behind the front line. They had 4 105mm howitzers dug into protected positions, designed to provide indirect fire support. The crews had been firing all night, sending shells arcing over the American lines to explode among Japanese assembly areas. Now the Japanese were on top of them. The artillery crews had no choice. They depressed their howitzers to minimum elevation. They loaded canister rounds, shells filled with hundreds of steel balls designed to spread like shotgun blasts. They fired directly into the charging Japanese troops at point-blank range. Each shot killed dozens of men. The guns fired so rapidly that barrels turned red-hot. Crews poured water on them to prevent warping. But the Japanese kept coming. They climbed over the bodies of their own dead. They charged straight into the artillery fire. Some were cut in half by canister rounds. Others were blown apart by high explosive shells. It did not matter. The survivors kept advancing. One gun crew ran out of ammunition. The Japanese reached their position. The Marines fought with pistols, rifle butts, entrenching tools, bare hands. All 6 men were killed. The Japanese destroyed the gun, then moved to the next position. This happened to 3 of the 4 guns. Only 1 howitzer survived, its crew managing to withdraw under covering fire from nearby infantry. Private Thomas Baker was with Company A of the 105th Infantry Regiment. Baker was 24 years old, from Troy, New York. He had grown up during the Depression, worked odd jobs, joined the National Guard in 1939 for the steady pay. He was a rifleman, nothing special, just another soldier doing his job. On July 6th, the day before the attack, Baker had been wounded in the leg by Japanese mortar fire. The wound was not serious enough to evacuate him, but it made walking difficult. He should have been in an aid station. Instead, he had returned to his foxhole. His company was under strength. They needed every man. When the Japanese attack hit, Baker's position was one of the first overrun. He fired his rifle until he ran out of ammunition. He threw his 2 grenades. Then the Japanese were in his foxhole. He fought them with his rifle as a club. He killed 3 men before the survivors retreated under fire from the neighboring foxhole. Baker's company withdrew under orders, falling back to a secondary defensive line. Baker tried to follow, but his wounded leg collapsed. He could not walk. Other soldiers tried to carry him. Baker refused. He knew the truth. If they carried him, they would move too slowly. They would all be killed. He ordered them to leave him. The soldiers left Baker propped against a tree with 8 rounds of ammunition in his rifle and a tree about 15 yards from his position. They gave him their remaining ammunition, 30 more rounds. Baker told them to go. They went. They had no choice. The Japanese advance swept past Baker's position. He fired carefully, one shot at a time. Each round dropped a Japanese soldier. He fired all 38 rounds. When his rifle was empty, he used it as a club against the Japanese soldier who reached his position. Then he died. Baker's body was found later that day. 15 dead Japanese soldiers lay around his position. The Japanese breakthrough reached the regimental command post at approximately 06:45 hours. This was the headquarters of the entire 105th Infantry Regiment. If this position fell, the regiment would cease to exist as an organized fighting unit. There were perhaps 80 men at the command post. Most were clerks, radio operators, supply personnel. They were not frontline infantry, but they had rifles and they knew how to use them. Colonel Leonard Bishop commanded the 105th Regiment. Bishop was 47 years old, from Albany, New York. He had served in World War I, earned a Silver Star at the Battle of the Argonne Forest, returned to civilian life as a banker, then been called back to active duty in 1940. He was methodical, careful, not given to heroics. But when the Japanese reached his command post, there was no time for caution. Bishop organized the defense personally. He positioned men in a perimeter around the command post. He had them use captured Japanese weapons and fortifications. The area had been a Japanese defensive position 2 days earlier. The fortifications were still intact. Bishop ordered his men into those positions. They fought from Japanese foxholes with American weapons, holding off an attack by Japanese forces who had just captured the American positions. The irony was not lost on anyone, but it worked. The command post held. Japanese troops surged around it, trying to find weak points, but the defenders poured rifle fire into every approach. The Japanese took heavy casualties and moved on, looking for easier targets. By 0700 hours, as dawn began to break over the Pacific, the Japanese attack started to lose momentum. Not because the attackers lost courage or determination. They had neither lost. They simply ran out of men. The assault had lasted nearly 2.5 hours. In that time, thousands of Japanese soldiers had charged straight into American defensive fire. Most of them were dead. The American line had buckled but not broken. The breakthrough had been contained. Reinforcements from the 2nd Marine Division had arrived and plugged the gaps. Artillery fire from positions further back had torn apart Japanese formations before they could exploit their initial success. And the sheer volume of American firepower, machine guns and rifles firing continuously for over 2 hours, had created a killing zone that nothing could cross. The Japanese who survived the initial assault found themselves trapped. Behind them was the ocean. Ahead was the American line, now reinforced and alert. To their sides were Marine units, moving in to encircle them. Some Japanese soldiers attempted to withdraw, others kept attacking, a few committed suicide rather than face capture. At 0800 hours, American forces began their counterattack. Marines from the 2nd Division advanced across the Tanapag Plain with tank support. They encountered scattered Japanese resistance. Small groups of soldiers, 5 or 10 men, hiding in shell craters or behind destroyed equipment, fighting until they were killed. There were no prisoners. The Japanese refused to surrender. The Americans had learned not to expect it. By noon on July 7th, the counterattack had regained all lost ground. The American line was re-established along the railroad track where it had been the night before, but the cost was staggering. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment had suffered 918 casualties, 406 men killed, 512 wounded. Out of 1,100 men who had defended the line the night before, only a few hundred remained combat effective. The Japanese casualties were catastrophic. American forces counted 4,311 dead Japanese soldiers on the battlefield. The actual number was likely higher. Some bodies had been destroyed by artillery, others had fallen into ravines or been washed into the ocean. But the confirmed count was 4,311. Nearly every Japanese soldier who participated in the attack was dead. 3 American soldiers from the 105th Infantry Regiment would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions on July 7th. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, for his leadership in rallying his battalion and dying at the front line with his men, Private Thomas Baker, for his refusal to be evacuated, and his final stand against overwhelming odds. Captain Benjamin Salomon, though his award would not come until 58 years later, in 2002, when President George W. Bush finally corrected the injustice that had denied him recognition because he was a medical officer. The Battle of Saipan continued for 2 more days. American forces pushed north toward Marpi Point at the island's northern tip. The remaining Japanese defenders, perhaps a few hundred men, retreated into caves and continued fighting until they were eliminated or killed themselves. On July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. But the horror did not end with the military battle. In the days following the Gyokusai attack, American troops witnessed something they were unprepared for. Japanese civilians, hundreds of them, began committing suicide. They jumped off cliffs at Marpi Point. They threw their children off first, then followed. Some slit their children's throats before jumping. Others held hands as families and leaped together. The cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Marines and soldiers watched helplessly as hundreds of people died. They tried to stop them. They used loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese, telling civilians they would not be harmed, that they would be treated humanely. Some civilians listened and surrendered. Many did not. The Japanese government had spread propaganda throughout the war. They told civilians that Americans were savages who would rape, torture, and cannibalize anyone they captured. They told them that death was preferable to capture. They told them that dying for the emperor was honorable. Many civilians believed it. The result was mass suicide on a scale American forces had never encountered. Estimates vary, but at least 8,000 Japanese civilians died on Saipan. Some were killed in the fighting. Many committed suicide. The exact number will never be known. But the psychological impact on American troops who witnessed it was profound. They had come to Saipan to fight soldiers. They found themselves watching mothers kill their children and themselves rather than accept rescue. The strategic impact of Saipan's capture was immediate and decisive. Within weeks, American engineers began constructing airfields. By November 1944, B-29 bombers were flying missions from Saipan to Tokyo. The bombing campaign would continue for the next 9 months, devastating Japanese cities and industrial capacity. The political impact in Japan was equally significant. When news of Saipan's fall reached Tokyo, it caused the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. Tojo had led Japan into war. He had promised victory. The loss of Saipan, considered part of Japan itself, proved that victory was impossible. Tojo resigned on July 18, 1944, 11 days after the Gyokusai attack. For the first time, a peace faction gained influence in the Japanese government. Not enough influence to end the war immediately. That would take another year and 2 atomic bombs. But the seeds of Japanese surrender were planted at Saipan. The recognition that the war could not be won began with the failure of the Gyokusai attack to drive American forces from the island. American military planners studied the Battle of Saipan carefully. They drew several conclusions. First, Japanese forces would fight with suicidal determination when defending territory they considered part of Japan itself. Second, Gyokusai attacks, while tactically devastating in their initial impact, were strategically ineffective. They inflicted casualties but could not reverse defeat. Third, any invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in casualties on a scale that made Saipan look minor by comparison. These conclusions influenced every subsequent decision in the Pacific War. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa were planned with the expectation of mass suicide attacks. The decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was influenced by estimates of casualties that would result from invading Japan. Those estimates were based partly on what happened at Saipan, but focusing only on strategic outcomes misses the human reality of what happened on that coastal plain on July 7, 1944. This was not a battle in the traditional sense. Battles involve tactical maneuver, exploitation of advantage, attempts to minimize casualties while achieving objectives. The gyokusai attack was none of those things. It was annihilation. A military force destroying itself, deliberately, knowingly, because cultural and political pressures made survival impossible, and death the only acceptable option. From the Japanese perspective, the attack made sense within their cultural framework. The concept of gyokusai had deep roots in Japanese military tradition. It dated back centuries to samurai codes that valued honor above life. The phrase, itself, shattering the jewel, came from a classical Chinese text that stated a true man would rather be the shattered jewel than the intact tile. Better to die with honor than live with shame. The Japanese military government had spent decades conditioning its population to accept this philosophy. They taught it in schools. They incorporated it into military training. They elevated it through propaganda and imperial ideology. By 1944, the idea that death was preferable to surrender had become so deeply ingrained that thousands of men, women, and children accepted it without question. But understanding the cultural context does not make the reality less horrifying. 4,000 men charged into machine gun fire knowing they would die. They did it because they were ordered to. They did it because they believed it was their duty. They did it because surrender was unthinkable. And they died, nearly all of them, achieving nothing except their own destruction and temporary chaos in the American lines. From the American perspective, the attack revealed something equally disturbing. American soldiers had been trained to fight an enemy who followed recognizable military logic, defend positions, conduct tactical withdrawals, surrender when further resistance became futile. The Japanese did none of these things. They fought until they died. They never surrendered. They launched attacks that had no possibility of success simply because dying while attacking was more honorable than dying while defending. This created a psychological problem for American troops. How do you fight an enemy who does not fear death? How do you negotiate with an enemy who prefers annihilation to compromise? The answer, for most American soldiers, was that you could not. You simply killed them until there were none left. That realization, that the war in the Pacific would end only with the complete destruction of Japanese military forces, shaped American attitudes for the rest of the war. The soldiers who survived the gyokusai attack carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Many wrote about it decades later. Their accounts are remarkably consistent. They describe the noise, the chaos, the sheer mass of men charging toward them. They describe firing until their rifles were too hot to hold, until their shoulders ached from recoil, until they ran out of ammunition and had to scavenge from dead comrades. They describe hand-to-hand fighting in foxholes, Japanese soldiers jumping in with bayonets and knives, the desperate struggle in darkness where you could not tell friend from enemy except by touch. They also describe the aftermath. Walking across the battlefield at dawn, seeing thousands of bodies scattered across open ground. Some soldiers counted the dead out of morbid curiosity. Others could not look. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, cordite, ruptured intestines, the sweet rot of death in tropical heat. Flies gathered in black clouds. The buzzing was audible from hundreds of yards away. Burial details worked for days. They dug mass graves, bulldozed bodies into them, covered them with coral and dirt. Some graves held hundreds of bodies. The work was gruesome, exhausting, psychologically damaging. Men who performed burial duty often requested transfer to frontline units. They preferred the risk of combat to the certainty of handling corpses. The 27th Infantry Division was so badly mauled at Saipan that it required months to rebuild. The 105th Regiment lost nearly half its strength. The survivors were sent to Espiritu Santo for rest and replacement training. New soldiers arrived to fill the gaps. The regiment eventually deployed to Okinawa in 1945, where they encountered similar Japanese tactics, though never again on the scale of Saipan. Captain Benjamin Salomon's story deserves particular attention because it reveals how cultural and institutional biases can deny recognition even for extraordinary heroism. Salomon was recommended for the Medal of Honor immediately after his death. Captain Edmund Love, the 27th Division historian, gathered eyewitness accounts from the soldiers whose lives Salomon had saved. He documented the 98 dead Japanese soldiers found in front of Salamon's position. He described the 76 bullet wounds and 24 bayonet wounds in Salamon's body. The recommendation was denied by Major General George Greiner, commanding officer of the 27th Division. The reason given was that Salomon was a medical officer. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were forbidden from bearing arms against the enemy, except in immediate self-defense. Greiner argued that Salomon's actions, while heroic, violated the convention and therefore could not be officially recognized. This reasoning was absurd. Salomon had not initiated combat. He had been attacked. His aid station had been overrun. He had killed Japanese soldiers, who were bayoneting wounded Americans in their beds. His subsequent defense of the position was necessary to allow evacuation of those wounded. Every aspect of his actions was defensive and protective of non-combatants, but the bureaucracy focused on the technicality that he was a medical officer, using a machine gun. The denial was also likely influenced by anti-Semitism. Salomon was Jewish. In 1944, American military leadership, while not overtly discriminatory, maintained institutional biases that made recognition of Jewish soldiers more difficult. Only 2 Jewish soldiers received the Medal of Honor during World War II. Many others were denied under questionable circumstances. Salomon's case fit this pattern. After the war, multiple attempts were made to reverse the decision. In 1951, Captain Love resubmitted the recommendation. It was denied again, this time with the excuse that the time limit for submitting World War II awards had expired. In 1969, another attempt was made. The Army Surgeon General endorsed it. The Secretary of the Army recommended approval. The Secretary of Defense rejected it without explanation. The injustice persisted for 58 years. It was not corrected until 1998, when Dr. Robert West, a dentist and alumnus of USC Dental School, learned of Salomon's story and began campaigning for recognition. West gathered support from military leadership, dental organizations, and congressional representatives. He navigated bureaucratic obstacles for 4 years. On May 1, 2002, President George W. Bush posthumously presented the Medal of Honor to Captain Benjamin Salomon. Dr. West accepted it on Salomon's behalf. There were no living members of the Salomon family. But there were surviving soldiers from the 105th Regiment, elderly men in their 80s, who traveled to Washington to witness the ceremony. They had waited nearly 60 years to see their surgeon honored. They wept openly when the medal was presented. The gyokusai attack at Saipan was the largest such attack in the Pacific War, but it was not the only one. Similar attacks occurred at Attu, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Each time, American forces faced thousands of Japanese soldiers charging in mass suicide attacks. Each time, the attacks were defeated through overwhelming firepower. Each time, nearly all the attackers died. The pattern revealed a fundamental flaw in Japanese military doctrine. Gyokusai attacks might have worked against technologically inferior opponents. They had been effective in China during the 1930s, where Chinese forces often lacked machine guns and artillery. But against American forces with integrated combined arms, air support, and unlimited ammunition, such attacks were simply mass suicide with no tactical benefit. Japanese military leadership recognized this. After Saipan, there were debates in Tokyo about whether to continue authorizing gyokusai attacks. Some officers argued they were wasteful, that forces should be preserved for defensive operations. Others argued that dying while attacking was preferable to dying while defending, that the psychological impact on the enemy justified the casualties. The debate became moot in August 1945, when Japan surrendered. But the doctrine of gyokusai, the willingness to order entire units to destroy themselves, reflected something deeply disturbing about how the Japanese military government valued human life. Soldiers were not individuals with inherent worth. They were tools, to be expended when useful, discarded when not. The gyokusai doctrine made this explicit. Your life has value only in how many enemies you kill while dying. American soldiers who encountered gyokusai attacks developed a bitter cynicism about Japanese military culture. They respected Japanese courage. They acknowledged Japanese fighting skill. But they could not understand the waste. Why throw away thousands of lives in attacks that could not possibly succeed? Why refuse surrender even when defeat was certain? Why order civilians to commit suicide rather than face capture? These questions had no satisfactory answers. The cultural gap was too wide. Americans valued individual life and saw surrender as acceptable when further resistance was futile. Japanese military culture valued collective honor and saw surrender as shameful. The two perspectives were incompatible. The result was a war of annihilation, where one side had to be completely destroyed because compromise was impossible. The soldiers of the 105th Infantry Regiment returned home after the war. Most tried to resume normal lives. They got jobs, married, raised families. They did not talk much about Saipan. The experience was too traumatic, too difficult to explain to people who had not been there. How do you describe watching thousands of men charge to their deaths? How do you explain killing until your rifle burned your hands and bodies piled so high you could not see over them? Some soldiers wrote memoirs decades later. They described the gyokusai attack in measured language, trying to convey the reality without sensationalism. They emphasized that Japanese soldiers fought bravely, that they showed remarkable courage, that they followed orders to the end. But they also emphasized the waste. 4,000 men died for nothing. They did not slow the American advance. They did not inflict proportional casualties. They simply died because their culture and government told them dying was more honorable than living. The battlefield at Tanapag Plain is quiet now. Saipan is part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, a U.S. territory. The coastal plain where the battle occurred is largely undeveloped. You can still see the railroad track, rusted and overgrown. You can walk the ground where the 105th Infantry Regiment held their line. The terrain explains everything. Open approaches, no cover, perfect fields of fire for defenders, suicide ground for attackers. A memorial stands near Tanapag village. It lists the names of American and Japanese soldiers who died in the battle. The American names are organized by unit. The Japanese names are organized by rank. There are thousands of names, too many to read in one visit. The memorial includes a quote from a Japanese officer who survived the war, though not the gyokusai attack. He had been evacuated before July 7th with severe wounds. He wrote, "We were ordered to die. We obeyed. That obedience destroyed us." Veterans of the 105th Regiment held reunions for decades after the war. They gathered annually, these aging men, sharing memories of Saipan and other battles. As years passed, their numbers dwindled. The last reunion was held in 2009. Fewer than 20 veterans attended. Most were in their 80s. They spoke about comrades who had not returned. They honoured Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, Private Baker, Captain Salomon. They remembered the night of July 7th, 1944, when they held a line against impossible odds and survived. The Battle of Saipan cost American forces 16,500 casualties, 3,100 killed, 13,000 wounded. Japanese military casualties were approximately 30,000 killed. Almost the entire garrison died. An additional 8,000 civilians died, many by suicide. Total deaths, 38,000 people, on an island 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. Those numbers are statistics. They convey scale but not reality. The reality was thousands of individual deaths, each one a person with history, family, hopes. The reality was young men from Troy and Schenectady dying in foxholes 6,000 miles from home. The reality was Japanese soldiers from Tokyo and Osaka charging into machine gun fire because orders and culture gave them no alternative. The reality was Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dentist, dying alone while operating a machine gun to save wounded men he barely knew. The story of the gyokusai attack at Saipan reveals how war becomes something beyond tactical calculations and strategic objectives. It reveals what happens when cultural values collide with modern firepower. It reveals the cost of ideologies that prioritize death over survival, and it reveals the courage of individuals, on both sides, who fought and died because they believed it mattered. 70 years after the battle, historians still debate whether the gyokusai attack achieved anything militarily significant. The consensus is that it did not. The attack inflicted casualties, disrupted American plans for one day, and demonstrated Japanese determination. But it did not change the outcome. Saipan was lost. The attack simply accelerated the end. Within 48 hours, the island was secure. Within a month, B-29 bombers were flying from Saipan to bomb Japan. But measuring the attack only by military outcomes misses something important. The attack mattered to the men who fought it. For Japanese soldiers, it was a choice to die on their terms rather than accept defeat. For American soldiers, it was a test of courage, under conditions few humans ever face. For historians, it is evidence of how cultural forces can drive military decisions toward catastrophic outcomes. The lesson, if there is one, is that wars are fought by people with beliefs, values, and limits. Understanding only the tactics and technology is insufficient. You must understand what drives men to charge into certain death, what allows others to stand and fight against overwhelming numbers, and what happens when two fundamentally incompatible worldviews meet in combat. At Saipan on July 7, 1944, those worldviews collided. 4,000 Japanese soldiers died. 900 American soldiers died, and the war continued for another year, grinding toward an end that would require atomic weapons to finally achieve. The soldiers who survived carried the memory forever. They understood, in ways civilians could not, that war is not glory or adventure or noble purpose. War is young men dying in mud, screaming for their mothers, bleeding out in darkness, while friends try desperately to save them. War is watching thousands charge to their deaths because culture and government decree it. War is killing until you are numb, until death becomes routine, until you wonder if you will ever feel normal again. And yet, within that horror, there are moments of extraordinary courage. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, standing in the open under fire, rallying his men, because leadership means sharing their danger. Private Baker, refusing evacuation because being carried would slow his comrades, choosing to die alone so others might live. Captain Salomon, ordering his aid station evacuated while he stayed behind with a machine gun, knowing he would not survive, but determining his patients would. These men did not fight because they loved death or sought glory. They fought because their comrades needed them. They fought because orders required it. They fought because failing meant others would die. That is the reality of combat, not grand strategy or noble causes, but immediate necessity. Hold this line because if you do not, the men behind you die. Defend this position because if you do not, everyone is lost. Fight because stopping means death for yourself and everyone depending on you. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.